At my grandson's birthday brunch. My daughter-in-law raised her glass and smiled. It was a beautiful Arizona morning. The kind where the sky looks endless and the sunlight feels warm without being harsh. I had set the long farmhouse table in my backyard just after sunrise. Fresh flowers in mason jars. Lemonade sweating gently in glass pitchers. A chocolate cake waiting inside for later. I turned 68 last spring. And I still host. Heather stood at the center of the table. Her linen dress pressed perfectly. Her hair falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She tapped her champagne glass lightly with a fork. The sound cut cleanly through conversation. Everyone turned. Daniel sat to her right. My grandson was busy poking at a balloon tied to his chair. Neighbors and friends leaned forward slightly, expecting something sentimental. Heather smiled at me. To family, she began smoothly, and to transitions. There it was. A few people chuckled politely. She continued, her tone light but deliberate. To the old woman who's about to simplify her life and finally let us take care of things. The laughter was softer this time. Not because it was funny. Because it was uncertain. I kept my expression calm. I even lifted my glass. When you reach my age, you learn something important about public moments. You don't react. You observe. Heather's eyes didn't leave my face as she finished her toast. She was measuring something, waiting for either embarrassment or resistance. Daniel didn't look at me. That told me enough. The word transition hovered in the air like perfume, subtle, but unmistakable. This wasn't spontaneous. It was strategic. Because you don't suggest someone is stepping aside unless you've already imagined the space they'll leave behind. I took a small sip of my mimosa and smiled. To continuity, I replied gently. Just 2 words. But intentional ones. A few guests nodded. Conversation resumed. The children went back to chasing each other across the lawn. But something had shifted. Not loudly. Not visibly. Quietly. The idea had been introduced. Publicly. That's how repositioning begins. Not with paperwork. With narrative. The rest of the brunch unfolded as planned. Cake was sliced. Photos were taken. My grandson opened his gifts and hugged me tightly around the waist. "Grandma, this is the best party," he whispered. I kissed the top of his head. "I'm glad," I said. But inside, I was replaying the toast. Because I have learned something else over the years. When someone frames your departure as inevitable, they are not celebrating you. They are preparing for you. Heather moved through the party lightly, laughing, refilling glasses, touching Daniel's arm in subtle reassurance. She looked relieved. As if a first step had been taken. And perhaps she believed it had. But here's what she didn't know. 15 years ago, when my husband passed away, I sat alone at this very kitchen table and made a different kind of decision. One that did not depend on champagne glasses or polite laughter. One that did not require consensus. Structure. While others grieved emotionally, I grieved strategically. Because grief sharpens clarity. And clarity builds protection. So when Heather raised her glass that morning and suggested my transition, she assumed something fragile. She assumed I hadn't already prepared. She assumed age meant flexibility. She assumed stability could be negotiated. She was wrong. The brunch ended. Chairs were folded. Guests drifted away. But the toast lingered. Not as humiliation. As confirmation. Because when someone publicly tests your place at your own table, the smartest response isn't volume. It's structure. And mine was already in place. After the toast, the party continued. Children ran across the grass. Balloons drifted lazily in the dry Arizona air. Someone turned the music back up. And I stayed seated at the end of the table. When you reach my age, people assume you don't notice small shifts in a room. They're wrong. Heather moved differently after that moment. Lighter, almost relieved, as if she had tested something and was waiting to see whether it would hold. Daniel avoided my eyes for the rest of the brunch. That told me more than any speech could. I didn't confront her. Not there. Not in front of neighbors and children and half-eaten cake. Public humiliation doesn't deserve public reaction. It deserves clarity. When I got home later that afternoon, the house greeted me the way it always does, quiet, steady, unchanged. I set my purse on the entry table, took off my sandals, walked into the kitchen. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft lines across the granite countertops. I poured myself a glass of water and stood there for a moment, listening to the stillness. This house has never been loud. It doesn't need to be. 15 years ago, after my husband passed, I sat at this same kitchen table with a stack of documents and a notary. Grief does something to you. It either scatters you or sharpens you. It sharpened me. That was the year I placed this home into irrevocable trust. Not because I feared my son. Not because I expected conflict. But because structure protects emotion from pressure. I had watched too many widows lose control of their own stability because paperwork lagged behind intention. I wasn't going to be one of them. The trust was simple. During my lifetime, the house remains under my full control. After I'm gone, it transfers directly to my grandson. Not to be leveraged. Not to be refinanced. Not to be restructured. Protected. At the time, Daniel thanked me for planning ahead. He called it responsible. What he didn't realize, what Heather certainly didn't, was that planning ahead means anticipating not just love, but stress. Stress changes tone. Stress makes people say things like, transition, and, simplify, and, it's time. I walked into the hallway and ran my hand lightly along the wall where faint pencil marks still show Daniel's height at ages 6, 8, 12. This house isn't an asset on a spreadsheet. It's a timeline. And timelines aren't surrendered because someone raises a champagne glass and frames it as concern. I didn't feel anger that afternoon. I felt confirmation. The toast wasn't spontaneous. It was momentum, a public suggestion designed to make the idea of my departure feel natural. But nothing about it was natural. Transitions don't begin with jokes. They begin with paperwork. And I had already completed mine. The next morning, I woke up at 6:10 a.m. Same as always. Arizona mornings don't rush you. The sky starts pale, almost fragile, and then deepens slowly into gold. I tied my walking shoes and stepped outside, locking the door behind me with the same steady click I've heard for years. Routine steadies perspective. As I walked past the trimmed desert shrubs and quiet stucco houses, I replayed Heather's words. About to simplify her life. Not if. Not maybe. About to. That phrasing matters. Halfway through my usual 2-mile loop, I passed Mrs. Patterson watering her roses. Lovely party yesterday, she said warmly. It was, I replied. She hesitated just a second too long before adding, big changes ahead, huh? There it was. The echo. Not confrontation. Circulation. I smiled politely. No changes, I said calmly. I'm staying exactly where I am. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, then she nodded. Momentum travels faster than correction. By the time I returned home, I understood something clearly. The brunch had been phase 1. Public suggestion. Now perception was doing the work. Inside, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table. The sunlight cut soft lines across the floor. The house felt unchanged. That's how you know it isn't fragile. I opened the drawer beside the stove and pulled out the trust folder. I didn't need to reread it. I knew the structure by memory. Lifetime control. Mine. Transfer upon death. My grandson. Independent fiduciary. Assigned. Clear language prevents emotional negotiation. But clarity must be current. So at 9:30 that morning, I called my attorney's office. Just a review, I said. An hour later, I was seated across from him, explaining the toast in simple terms. No direct pressure? He asked. Not yet, I replied, just positioning. He nodded knowingly. Social framing often comes before structural requests. Exactly. We reviewed the documents line by line. Everything remained intact. Still, I added one precaution, a reinforcement clause clarifying that no sale, transfer, or representation of incapacity could occur without certified medical evaluation and my direct consent. Not dramatic. Preventative. Aging is often used as a narrative lever. I don't allow levers. When I left his office, the Arizona sun was high and bright. Heat clarifies thought. That afternoon, a glossy envelope arrived in the mail. A senior living brochure. Beautiful courtyard photos, organized activities, words like maintenance-free and peace of mind. I didn't tear it up. I placed it inside the trust folder. Documentation matters. Later that evening, Daniel called. We're just thinking long-term, he repeated. So am I answered calmly. There was silence on the line. You don't trust us? He asked quietly. I trust the structure, I replied. Trust in people is emotional. Trust in documents is durable. The brunch had been public. The brochure was private. The conversation was cautious. The pattern was forming. Heather believed introducing the idea gently would make it inevitable. But inevitability only works when structure is undefined. Mine wasn't. And reinforcement, when done early, prevents escalation later. By Wednesday afternoon, the brochure was no longer subtle. It sat on my kitchen counter, glossy and deliberate. A senior living community 20 minutes away. Landscaped courtyards, group fitness, maintenance-free lifestyle. Maintenance-free. I ran my fingers lightly across the paper and then folded it once. Neatly, before placing it in the drawer beside the trust documents. Paper belongs with paper. Not on display. That evening, Daniel called. Mom, can we come by Sunday? He asked. Of course, I said. His voice was careful. That told me Heather would be coming too. Sunday arrived warm and bright. The Arizona sun pressing gently against the windows. I set 3 glasses of water on the dining table. No coffee, no lunch. This wasn't social. Heather walked in first, composed, carrying a slim leather folder. Daniel followed behind her. We sat. No one rushed to speak. Finally, Heather leaned forward. We've been reviewing long-term planning. She began smoothly, and we think it's important to have a realistic conversation. Realistic. That's wise, I replied calmly. I prefer realistic. She slid a printed sheet across the table, a property market estimate. Current value, projected appreciation. With prices where they are, she continued, this could be an ideal time to reposition assets. Reposition. I didn't touch the paper. And where would I reposition? I asked evenly. Daniel cleared his throat. Maybe something smaller, he said, more manageable. I manage just fine, I replied. Heather's smile tightened slightly. It's not about capability, she said, it's about timing. There it was again. Timing. As if life were a calendar they could adjust. I've already handled timing, I said calmly, 15 years ago. They both looked at me. When your father passed, I continued, nodding toward Daniel, I placed this house into a trust. During my lifetime, every decision about this property is mine. Daniel frowned. I didn't realize it was that structured. It is, I said. Heather leaned back slightly. So selling isn't even an option? Not under pressure, I replied. The room grew very still. Outside, a car door shut somewhere down the street. Ordinary sound, ordinary afternoon. Extraordinary clarity. We're not trying to pressure you, Daniel said quietly. I know, I answered, but suggestion becomes pressure when repeated. Heather closed her folder slowly. This feels inflexible. It is, I said, on purpose. Because flexibility in the wrong direction becomes surrender. I stood and walked to the sideboard, retrieving a single page from the drawer. I placed it in front of them. This document confirms that no sale, no transfer, and no restructuring can occur without my explicit consent. Daniel read it carefully. Heather's eyes moved faster. Authority doesn't need volume. It needs documentation. This house, I said calmly, is not a financial solution. It's part of a long-term plan already decided. No anger. No accusation. Just definition. They left without argument. After the door closed, I stood in the quiet dining room and let the stillness settle. The brunch had been public momentum. This was private reinforcement. And reinforcement doesn't shout. It stands. After Sunday's meeting, the house felt the same. That's how you know you made the right decision. Nothing trembled. Nothing shifted. The walls did not absorb anxiety. They stood. On Tuesday morning, I walked my usual route through the neighborhood. The desert air was already warming, the sun climbing steadily over the rooftops. Mrs. Patterson waved from her driveway. "Heard you might be making changes," she said casually. There it was again. Not confrontation. Echo. I smiled politely. "No changes," I replied. "I'm staying exactly where I am." She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her roses. Momentum doesn't require agreement. It requires repetition. Heather had planted the idea once at brunch, then reinforced it with suggestion. Now it was circulating socially. That told me something important. This wasn't just about selling a house. It was about shaping perception. If enough people assumed I was transitioning, then resistance would look stubborn instead of strategic. When I returned home, I opened the drawer beside the stove and took out the senior living brochure again. I studied it carefully this time. Beautiful courtyard. Organized activities. Neutral smiling faces. Nothing about it was offensive. But nothing about it was mine. That afternoon, Daniel stopped by alone. He stood in the entryway for a moment before stepping inside. "She feels like you shut her down," he said. I clarified structure. I replied calmly. He exhaled slowly. "She thought there was room for discussion." "There is," I said. "There isn't room for assumption." He walked into the living room and looked around. "You've always been steady," he said. "I had to be," I answered. "When your father passed, no one offered me a transition. No one suggested simplifying. I learned to manage everything because I had no alternative." Daniel nodded, but his shoulders were tense. "We're feeling pressure," he admitted quietly. That was the first honest sentence I had heard. "Pressure doesn't entitle you to reposition someone else," I said gently. He didn't argue. Because he knew. I poured us both a glass of water and we sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he once did math homework and asked me how interest rates worked. Now he understood them firsthand. "We're not drowning," he said, "but things are tighter than we expected." I nodded. "And that makes other people's stability look accessible," I said. He didn't deny it. Silence settled between us. Not hostile. Clear. "I don't want this to become a wedge," he said. "It won't," I replied, "as long as we keep structure separate from stress." That's the line. Stress changes tone. Structure protects intention. Before he left, he paused at the door. "She thought you'd soften," he said quietly. "I don't soften under pressure," I answered. "I reinforce." After he drove away, I stood in the kitchen for a moment and let that word settle. Reinforce. The brunch had been a public test. Sunday had been a private negotiation. Now this was recalibration. Heather wasn't reckless. She was strategic. But strategy only works when the foundation is undefined. Mine wasn't. And that made all the difference. For a week, nothing happened. No brochures. No market reports. No casual mentions of timing. Silence can mean surrender. Or it can mean recalculation. The following Saturday, my grandson spent the afternoon at my house while Daniel and Heather attended a school fundraiser. He sat at the kitchen counter coloring dinosaurs while I sliced apples. "Mom says we might get a bigger house," he said casually. I kept my hand steady. "Oh?" I replied gently. "Yeah, she said it'll be easier when Grandma moves." There it was. Not dramatic. Not malicious. Just repeated. Children don't invent narratives, they echo them. I handed him an apple slice and smiled. "And what do you think about that?" I asked. He shrugged. "I like your house." That was enough. After he left that evening, I sat at the dining table with the trust documents open in front of me. Not because I doubted them. Because clarity needs reinforcement. The clause we added last week sat quietly in the middle of the page, language protecting against any attempt to represent me as incapable without medical basis. I hadn't mentioned it to Daniel. I hadn't mentioned it to Heather. And I hoped I wouldn't have to. But repetition matters. When a narrative shifts from, "it might be time," to, "when grandma moves," the framing is expanding. The next afternoon, Heather called. Her tone was measured. "I hope there's no tension," she began. "There isn't," I replied. "I just want to make sure we're aligned." She continued. "We don't want things to get complicated later." "They won't," I said calmly. "They're already defined." Silence. "I worry about you being alone," she added. "I'm not alone," I answered. "I'm independent." "That's not the same thing." "It is when chosen." The line held. She exhaled softly. "We're just trying to plan responsibly." "And so did I said. "Years ago." The call ended without resolution. But something had changed. Heather wasn't pushing loudly anymore. She was weaving language carefully into the future. And that's when I understood the next step wasn't about confrontation. It was about visibility. If perception was spreading quietly, then clarity needed to be just as public. Not dramatic. Not defensive. Visible. Because stability isn't just about paperwork. It's about narrative control. And I wasn't ready to let someone else write mine. On Thursday evening, I hosted book club. 8 women, lemon cake, iced tea, folding chairs arranged in a loose circle in my living room. Ordinary. Intentional. Visibility matters. Halfway through our discussion, Carol glanced at me and said casually, "Heather mentioned you might be making some changes soon." There it was again. Not sharp. Not hostile. Just circulating. I smiled gently. "No changes," I said clearly. "I plan to stay exactly where I am." The room settled immediately. No follow-up questions. No raised eyebrows. Clarity, when spoken calmly, travels faster than speculation. After the women left and the house quieted, I sat alone for a moment and thought about that exchange. Heather wasn't shouting narratives. She was letting them drift. If people assume something long enough, it begins to feel inevitable. And inevitability reduces resistance. The next afternoon, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. No folder this time, no agenda. He stood near the entryway, hands in his pockets. "Book club went well?" he asked. "It did," I replied. He hesitated. "She's embarrassed," he said quietly. "About what?" I asked. "About people thinking you're moving." I nodded slowly. "That's because the suggestion traveled," I said. He leaned against the doorway. "She didn't think it would spread." "That's how momentum works," I answered. "It doesn't stay contained." Silence lingered between us. "I should have stopped it sooner," he admitted. "Yes," I said gently. No accusation. Just truth. He looked around the living room, the framed photos, the worn leather chair his father once claimed as his own. "I never meant for you to feel replaced," he said. "I don't feel replaced," I replied. "I felt repositioned." There's a difference. Replacement implies removal. Repositioning implies strategic movement. He understood that. Later that evening, Heather sent a short group message to a few neighbors clarifying that there were no immediate plans for me to move. Simple, public, corrective. Not dramatic. But necessary. Momentum had reversed. Not because I argued. Because I clarified. The next Sunday, Daniel and my grandson came over to help me repaint the patio railing. As we worked, my grandson said, "Grandma's house isn't going anywhere." Daniel glanced at me. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." And for the first time since that brunch toast, I believed the message had landed. Not emotionally. Structurally. The house remained the same. The paperwork remained intact. But something else had shifted. Not ownership. Understanding. Heather wasn't reckless. She was reacting to pressure. And pressure had made her miscalculate. She assumed stability was negotiable. Now she knew it wasn't. Stability, once structured, doesn't bend for convenience. It stands. And that's exactly what this house was still doing. 2 weeks passed without incident. No more brochures. No more quiet suggestions. No more careful wording about timing. On the surface, everything had settled. But stability doesn't mean forgetfulness. One evening, Daniel invited me over for dinner. Just family, no guests, no performance. Heather greeted me at the door with a small, deliberate smile. "Thank you for coming," she said. The tone was different now. Less polished. More measured. We sat at their dining table, smaller than mine, closer together. Halfway through the meal, Heather set her fork down. "I owe you something," she said quietly. Daniel glanced at her but didn't interrupt. "I thought if we introduced the idea gradually, it would feel natural," she continued. "I didn't realize how it would sound outside of our stress." There it was. Stress. The word had finally replaced planning. "I understand stress," I replied calmly. "I don't understand repositioning someone without consent." She nodded. That was wrong. Not defensive. Not strategic. Just direct. Silence filled the room, but it wasn't heavy this time. It was honest. Daniel leaned back in his chair. "We've adjusted things," he said. "Cut back on expenses. Refinanced differently. It's tighter, but it's ours." That mattered. Not because they were struggling. Because they stopped looking outward for relief. "I'm not your backup plan," I said gently. "I'm your foundation." Heather's eyes softened slightly. "And we treated you like leverage," she admitted. "Yes," I answered. No anger in it. Just acknowledgement. After dinner, my grandson pulled me toward the living room to show me a school project, a drawing of our family. 4 figures. One house in the background. Mine. I studied it for a moment. "You forgot your own house," I teased. He shook his head. "That's the big one." Perspective is simple at 6 years old. Later, as I stood at the door preparing to leave, Heather stepped closer. "I won't bring it up again," she said. "Good," I replied. Because repetition is how pressure returns. Driving home through the warm Arizona night, I felt something settle fully for the first time since the brunch. Not victory. Alignment. The trust remained intact. The clauses remained unused. But the dynamic had shifted. Heather had miscalculated. She believed stability could be negotiated. Now she understood it was already defined. The house wasn't just standing. It was understood. And understanding, when it replaces assumption, is stronger than any toast ever raised. Life didn't dramatically transform after that dinner. It adjusted. And adjustment is quieter than conflict. Over the next month, I noticed small changes. Daniel began handling more of his own repairs instead of casually suggesting I might want help with mine. Heather stopped using words like transition or simplify. Conversations returned to normal topics: school schedules, grocery prices, summer heat. Normalcy can be earned. One Saturday morning, Daniel came by with a toolbox. "Thought I'd fix that loose gate hinge," he said. I hadn't asked him to. I watched him work from the patio chair, sunlight warming the concrete beneath us. "You know," he said after a while, "I used to think planning ahead meant preparing for loss." "It does," I replied. But I didn't realize it also meant preventing pressure. That sentence told me something had shifted inside him. Pressure doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it disguises itself as urgency. Heather had been operating from urgency. Now Daniel understood the difference. Later that afternoon, Heather texted me a photo. It was their new, smaller vehicle parked in the driveway. Captionless. Just the image. A choice. Not forced by me. Chosen by them. That mattered more than any apology. Because correction without resentment is growth. A week later, we all gathered again, not for a birthday. Not for a meeting, just dinner at my house. No tension in the air. No subtext. Heather helped set the table without commentary. Daniel poured water into glasses the way he used to when he was younger. Halfway through the meal, Heather looked up and said, "I didn't understand what legacy meant." No one rushed to fill the silence. "It's not ownership," she continued quietly. "It's continuity." Continuity. That word had come full circle. "Yes," I said simply. My grandson ran through the hallway, laughing, nearly knocking over a chair. Heather smiled instead of flinching. The house absorbed the sound easily. After dinner, as we cleared plates, Daniel paused beside me. "I'm glad you didn't bend," he said. "I didn't need to," I replied. "Because here's the truth. The trust never needed to activate. The clause never needed to be enforced. Structure worked because it existed, not because it was threatened." That night, after they left, I stood in the living room for a moment and looked around. The framed photos hadn't moved. The walls hadn't shifted. But something inside the dynamic had recalibrated. Not because I won. Because clarity replaced assumption. Heather had miscalculated. She thought stability could be repositioned. Now she understood it was rooted. And roots don't respond to momentum. They hold. The brunch toast felt distant now. Not erased. Just contextualized. It had been a test. And the test revealed exactly what I already knew. When someone raises a glass and suggests your ending, make sure you've already written your continuation. And I had. By early fall, the air in Scottsdale softened. The brutal summer heat eased into warm evenings and longer shadows. I began sitting outside more often, a glass of iced tea resting on the small table beside me. The house felt steady. Not triumphant. Just steady. Daniel stopped by one evening after work. No toolbox this time, no paperwork. He sat across from me on the patio, elbows resting on his knees. "I've been thinking about that brunch," he said. "So have I," I replied calmly. He nodded. "I let it happen." "Yes," I said gently. "No blame in it, just truth." He looked out at the yard where his son now rode a small scooter in circles. "I thought if we could get ahead financially, everything else would calm down," he admitted. "I didn't realize we were creating a different kind of instability." That was the first time he framed it that way. Instability. Not inconvenience. Not timing. Instability. "You were solving forward," I said, "but without considering what was already built behind you." He exhaled slowly. "I see that now." Silence settled between us, but it wasn't tense, it was reflective. Heather joined us a few minutes later, carrying 3 glasses of lemonade. She handed me mine without hesitation, then sat down. "I used to think structure was rigid," she said quietly. "Now I realize it's protection." I met her eyes. "It's both," I answered. "Because structure feels rigid only to the person who wants flexibility." She nodded. "I don't want to undo what you built," she said. "I just didn't know how to handle the pressure we were under." Pressure again. But this time it wasn't an excuse. It was context. "Pressure isn't the enemy," I replied. "Misplacing it is." Daniel looked at Heather, then back at me. "We've made adjustments," he said. "Budget changes, different timeline for upgrades. It's slower, but it's ours." That word mattered. Ours. Not yours. Not shared. Theirs. The sun dipped lower, casting long gold across the patio concrete. My grandson zoomed past us again, laughing. "Grandma's house is the best one," he announced loudly. Heather smiled at that. Not tightly. Genuinely. Later that evening, after they left, I walked through the living room slowly. The framed photos on the wall, Daniel at 5 years old, missing his front tooth. My husband standing proudly beside the half-finished fence he built himself. The first Christmas after we moved in. Legacy isn't loud. It doesn't demand. It stands quietly until someone tests it. The brunch had been a test. Not of love. Of structure. And structure held. No clauses activated. No legal battles. No dramatic fallout. Just clarity. Clarity about ownership. Clarity about authority. Clarity about continuity. When someone suggests your transition before you're ready, it can feel like erasure. But erasure only succeeds where structure is weak. Mine wasn't. And now, neither was the understanding around it. The house remained. Not because I fought for it. Because I prepared for it. And preparation, when done early enough, turns confrontation into recalibration. That was the real shift. Not the toast. Not the meeting. The recalibration. And once that happens, everything else settles into place. By winter, the rhythm of our family felt different. Not distant. Just clearer. The conversations no longer carried hidden agendas. No coded language about timing. No sideways mentions of market conditions. The house was no longer a topic. It was simply home. One Saturday afternoon, Daniel came over early to help hang new outdoor lights along the patio. The desert sky was soft and pale. The kind of cool Arizona day that makes you forget how intense summer can be. He stood on the ladder while I handed him the hooks. "You know," he said casually, "I used to think you were being stubborn." "I know," I replied. He paused. "You weren't." "No," I said gently, "I was being consistent." Consistency looks like resistance when someone expects flexibility. He climbed down from the ladder and looked at the lights stretched neatly above us. "I didn't understand the difference between support and access," he admitted. That sentence stayed with me. Support is offered. Access is assumed. And the brunch had blurred that line. Later that week, Heather invited me to join her for coffee. Not to discuss finances, not to review anything, just coffee. We sat outside a small cafe near her office. The air cool but comfortable. "I've been thinking about that day," she said quietly. "The toast." I didn't rush to answer. I thought if I framed it lightly, it wouldn't feel threatening, she continued, but it was. "Yes," I said calmly. She nodded. I didn't realize how public suggestion can feel like removal. That was closer than anything she'd said before. "It does," I replied, "especially when it comes from inside the family." She stirred her coffee slowly. "I don't want you to feel like we're waiting for something." "I don't," I said, "because now I know you're not." And I meant that. There was no performance in her tone this time. No calculation. Just understanding. When I drove home, I passed the park where my grandson now played soccer on Saturdays. Daniel stood on the sidelines cheering. Heather beside him, bundled lightly against the breeze. Family isn't defined by tension. It's defined by how tension resolves. That evening, as I locked the front door and walked through the quiet hallway, I paused at the height marks still faintly visible on the wall. 5 years old. 8. 12. Continuity. The brunch had tested that continuity. Not by accident. By assumption. And assumptions are fragile when structure exists. The trust remained untouched. The clause remained unused. The fiduciary never needed to intervene. Because clarity arrived before escalation. And that's the quiet victory no one sees. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just stable. The house stood. The family adjusted. And I never had to raise my voice to make that happen. That's what preparation does. It transforms potential conflict into recalibration. And once recalibrated, everything breathes easier. Almost a year to the day after that birthday brunch, we gathered in the same backyard again. Same long farmhouse table. Same string lights overhead. Same Arizona sky stretching wide and clear above us. But everything felt different. This time, there was no undercurrent, no careful glances, no invisible negotiation happening beneath the surface of conversation. My grandson was turning 6. He ran across the yard with the same energy he had the year before. But now his laughter filled the space without tension hanging behind it. I stood at the head of the table as plates were passed around. Heather moved beside me naturally. Not strategically. Daniel set down a pitcher of lemonade and adjusted one of the chairs without being asked. Normal. Earned normal. At one point, Daniel picked up his glass and tapped it lightly with a fork. The same sound that had cut through the air a year ago. For a moment, the memory flashed, Heather's toast. The word transition hovering unfinished in the sunlight. But this time, Daniel spoke first. I just want to say thank you, he said, looking at me, for building something that holds. No jokes. No implications. Just gratitude. Heather nodded quietly beside him. And for protecting it, she added. The words didn't feel performative. They felt understood. I lifted my glass slowly. Here's to continuity, I said. Not transition. Continuity. The word settled warmly over the table. After cake was served and the candles were blown out, my grandson ran up to me and wrapped his arms around my waist. Grandma, this is the best house, he said confidently. I smiled. It's a good house, I replied. But what I meant was, it's a steady house. Later, when the guests had gone and the yard was quiet again, Heather lingered near the patio. I misread the situation last year, she said softly. Yes, I answered. I thought stability could be adjusted. It can, I said gently, but only by the person who built it. She nodded. And I understand that now. That was enough. No dramatic apology. No rewriting of history. Just recognition. Daniel joined us, slipping his hands into his pockets the way he used to when he was a teenager trying to look casual. I'm glad you didn't give in, he said. I didn't need to, I replied. Because here's the truth. The toast wasn't the threat. The assumption was. The assumption that age means readiness to step aside. The assumption that pressure justifies repositioning. The assumption that stability is negotiable. But stability, when structured properly, isn't negotiable. It's protected. As the sun dipped lower and painted the stucco walls in gold, I stood alone for a moment and looked at the house. The same walls. The same hallway with faint pencil marks tracking Daniel's childhood growth. The same kitchen table where paperwork had been signed years before anyone imagined conflict. Nothing had changed. And that was the point. The trust remained intact. The clauses remained unused. The authority remained clear. But something deeper had shifted. Respect. Not demanded. Earned. A year ago, someone raised a glass and suggested my ending. Today, I raised mine and affirmed my continuation. And in the quiet that followed, I understood something simple. Legacy isn't passed down by surrender. It's preserved by preparation. The house stood. The family adjusted. And continuity, not transition, defined the story. That is how it ends. Not with departure. But with definition.